So Paulo Freire was born in 1921 in Brazil to a middle-class family, but when he was 13 years old, his father passed away, and so that and the Great Depression plunged his family into a state of poverty. And so he grew up playing stickball with the local children, and he fell behind in his own education. And so that had a profound impact on him. So later on, when he was in his 20s, his family's fortune did turn around, and he was able to enter law school, and he began to study the philosophy of language and phenomenology, and did get his law degree, but didn't end up actually practicing law. He instead became a teacher and had various appointments within the government or within the university system in which he could apply his theory of education. And so he is the author of this book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which he researched in the early 60s during his field work. He became really committed to a liberatory style of education, which is outlined in his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which was published in 1968. And after the significant acclaim that his book received, as well as the blowback from different apartheid governments, the book was banned in South Africa. Certain military governments banned the book, and indeed in 1964 during the Brazilian coup, he was arrested first and imprisoned, and then lived in political exile, and even was to get a one-year visiting professorship at Harvard. But he previously wrote a book on freedom and education, and so this was a subsequent follow-up to his previous book. But he is considered one of the significant members of the critical pedagogy discipline, and especially, that came forth in the 1970s. And of course, this is within a context of global decolonialization project. And so, damn, got a visit of Ash on me. And so in this video, I want to talk about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This is a classic book in critical education theory, and it was published in the late 1960s and became an instant hit within education programs. And so for our purposes, and for my purposes, why I would assign this book is for my students to understand this kind of sociology of education, to understand and for us to critically reflect on an institution in which we are all embedded at the current moment. And so considering that this book was written in the 1960s during global social movements, decolonialization projects, how does this book's significance continue to resonate in our contemporary period? So in the preface, he opens in the first sentence stating that this book was written during his 6 years of political exile, and he was reflecting back from this position within the United States on his educational activities in Brazil. And so even on this first page of the preface, he puts out a question that I myself would pose to my students, for example, as the question. And he's saying that the people are afraid of their own freedom, and that's why things don't change. And so I would put that out as the first kind of discussion question of how do we see that the people are still afraid of freedom, and what would it look like if they did not have this fear of freedom? He states on page 10, the next page, men and women rarely admit their fear of freedom openly, however, tending rather to camouflage it by presenting themselves as defenders of freedom. And this fear of freedom is the maintenance of the status quo. He says on page 11 of the preface that thought and study alone did not produce Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It is rooted in concrete situations and describes the reactions of laborers and of middle-class persons whom I have observed directly or indirectly during the course of my education work. So that's the second part of his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is not just the transformation of education into a liberatory structure, but also that it must be rooted in practice. It must have some outcome in the material world. And so on page 13 of the preface, he does give us some insight into what this lack of fear of freedom might look like. This individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled. This person is not afraid to meet the people or to enter into dialogue with them. So to be open to the truth of the world, even though it might be unpleasant and even unbearable, and then at the same time to hear that truth, to take it in, and at the same time to link arms with the working class, with the revolutionary struggle. And he says that this is a task for radicals. It cannot be carried out by sectarians. And that just means people that are willing to really go to the root of the issue and not play these party politics. And so that's just the preface. So then we get into the chapters of this book. This book is short but dense, and it has the preface and then just 4 conceptual chapters that are each offer a piece of his theory. And now we turn to chapter 1, which is the justification for a pedagogy of the oppressed. So in chapter 1, he jumps right into it and says the main problem of humanization has always been about the central issue of humanization and dehumanization, and those two opposed processes are the core of the social problem that he's examining. So you have the oppressed, the laborers, the peasants, and you have the oppressors, the landowners, the employers, those who are utilizing the labor of the workers. And so the oppressed are born in and brought into this system, and the oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopting his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. They understand this world even though they're oppressed within it. It is understandable. They can't imagine a different world in which this system was not in place. And so either the oppressor is the one on the top, or if the workers revolted and became on the top of the system, they just imagine themselves within the same system, but on the top rather than the bottom. And Freire is challenging people to break outside of thinking about this system based on oppression into a totally different model that would not be based on oppression, that would be based on equality and liberatory education. To surmount the situation of oppression, people must first critically recognize its causes and the alternative which would make possible the pursuit of a fuller humanity. So it's the struggle of the people, of the peasants, of the workers, of the oppressed class to struggle to transform the situation and to struggle for humanization, for subjectivity. Here on page 22 of the introduction, he states his thesis, in which he states, "This book will present some aspects of what the writer has termed the pedagogy of the oppressed, a pedagogy which must be forged with, not for, the oppressed. This pedagogy makes oppression and its causes objects of reflection by the oppressed. The central problem is this: how can the oppressed, as divided, unauthentic beings, participate in developing the pedagogy of their liberation?" He talks about true solidarity. He states, quote, "True solidarity is found only in the plenitude of this act of love, in its extensiality, in its praxis." So solidarity as love and an act of love is a key concept into understanding the process of humanization. And he talks about the critique of objectivity versus subjectivity. And he says that subjectivity is merely the process of humanization, and that it is to deny the importance of subjectivity in the process of transforming the world and the history is naive and simplistic. It is to admit the impossible, a world without people. Since we're talking about the process of humanization, then this is a process of subjectivity, and there is no objectivity when we're talking about real people and real situations that are dynamic and multi-layered. On page 29 of the introduction, he's talking about the role of violence, and he says, he's stating, never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. How could they be the initiators if they themselves are the result of violence? And so violence is what is upholding this entire system of the oppressed and the oppressors. And so he's implying that violence then would be something that would be between two equals, between two classes that are equal to each other. But if you have this lopsided situation where one group as the oppressors have complete control over the other group, then the other group is not responsible for violence because they live within this context created out of violence. Their mere existence and origin is born of violence. He's saying not only can the oppressed potentially free themselves, but they are also capable of freeing their oppressors. And by that he means that both sides would leave this system of oppression and inequality and move to another system based on mutuality. But the reverse is not possible. It's not possible for the oppressors to liberate the oppressed, because indeed their entire system is based on this inequality, and that would just, that would be like them abolishing themselves. That would be a paradox. He's saying that the oppressors also can define themselves as feeling oppressed in this situation, because anything less than them being superior is considered in their own minds to be oppression that they are suffering. And so we see this situation in which people of the oppressor class call out and feel that they themselves are being oppressed because the oppressed are asking for their fair share of the pie. And so to the oppressor, that feels like now they are being oppressed because they must at all times be in this superior, higher category. Yeah, like he continues that thought on page 33, where he says the oppressors do not perceive their monopoly on having more as a privilege which dehumanizes others and themselves. They cannot see that in the egotistical pursuit of having as a possessing class, they suffocate in their own possessions and no longer are. They merely have. For them, having more is an inalienable right. So therefore, we can see that in different categories and demographics of people who are on the privilege spectrum of the hierarchies within demographics and power and inequality, and that they do have this sense then when they hear the charges from the oppressed classes for their fair share, that those of the oppressor classes completely reject that and feel that it is their inalienable right, however they justify it, to have more. And he's saying, like, while the people are in pursuit of freedom and love and solidarity, the oppressor class is based on this sadistic love, a perverted love, a love of death, not of life. One of the characteristics of the oppressor consciousness and its necrophilic view of the world is thus sadism. And so sadism, sadistic love, comes out of the oppressor class, which is ultimately, you could think about of the processes of capitalism. That is sadism, it's violence. He's saying you do have people from the oppressor class that might join in the struggle for liberation, but they almost always have this brainwashing and superiority complex that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for them to really challenge and move beyond. For example, think about someone from a wealthy background really giving up their resources, their money, to the people. Like, can we conceive and see examples of that kind of behavior happening? It's like almost unheard of. And the oppressed themselves have a place within the system, and so therefore that creates this security. At least they know their position, they know what to expect, they understand their relationship, they can identify with the oppressor and with the oppressive class in hopes that they can someday become a member of that class. And so they have an emotional dependence on the oppressor class, on this entire system, and they have an investment in this system because at least, even though it's an oppressive system, it provides a sense of known, what's known, a sense of security as far as what's to be expected, and that they get their little token of appreciation. And so the oppressed, he states on page 42, who have been shaped by the death-affirming climate of oppression must find through their struggle the way to life-affirming humanization. And so thinking about the oppressor class, the oppressive system as this kind of death cult, and the struggle of the oppressed, the struggle of the people is towards a pathway of love, of humanity, of connection, of dialogue, and mutual listening and praxis, action, that will be put in place to make this world a better place for the oppressed classes. And so at the very end of chapter 1, he has a transition paragraph into chapter 2, which talks about a revolutionary leadership, and that this will be a co-intentional education. Teachers and students are both subjects, and that they will work together. It's an action of mutuality. And so in the first chapter, he's just laying out his ideology that there's this oppressive system, the oppressors, the oppressed, that they are both kind of positioned within this dichotomy, that they know their place, that they're both invested in upholding the system, and that now we have to now the oppressed class has to be convinced to go against the oppressors, which, you know, is a huge risk. It risks everything for this process and hope of freedom, of liberation, and specifically in education, like using education as a model for liberation and humanity, which he gets into in chapter 2. So now we turn to chapter 2, and from chapter 1 to chapter 2, I think the main takeaway is that in chapter 1, it's talking about the economic, the social situation and context of a society. And so in this case, it's the oppressed and the oppressors, and how that larger social context is then going to shape every institution within it, including the education system. And so if you're coming from a society in which there's an oppressor class and there's the oppressed workers, that's going to be reproduced within the educational system. And he says that is what's happening, but the path towards liberation is basically for the oppressed people to take over the educational system and somehow use that as a tool for their own liberation. So in chapter 2, he's analyzing and setting out a blueprint of what the educational system does. On the first page, he's talking about the relationships. This relationship involves a narrating subject, the teacher, and patient listening object, the students. So before, in the oppressor-oppressed societal context, the oppressed are dehumanized, so that it's a situation of humanization versus dehumanization, and they are oppressed because the system creates them into objects. And so here you have it on a smaller, specific institutional scale of education, and how that translates into this particular context now. He says on the first page, 45 of chapter 2, his task, the teacher, is to fill, quote, the student with the content of his narration, contents which are detached from reality, disconnected from the totality that engendered them and could give them significance. In the next sentence and paragraph, he says, the outstanding characteristic of this narrative education, then, is the sonority of words, not their transforming power. So basically that this knowledge gets distilled down into these words that are transmitting, lacking any kind of context, substance relevant to life. It's just this distilled shell words. And he's, remember, someone who was studying the philosophy of language and language acquisition and the power of language. So he really does focus on language in particular. And on the second page of this chapter 2, he talks about how education thus becomes an act of depositing, in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. And the next paragraph says, in the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. So from this chapter, we get the concept of the banking model of education, in which the student is an empty vessel, the teacher deposits into them, they know nothing, and the teacher gives them the knowledge. And so he's saying on the third page then of this chapter, on the contrary, banking education maintains and even stimulates the contradiction through the following attitudes and practices which mirror oppressive societies as a whole. So yes, the banking model of education mirrors the oppressive structures of the larger society. And he lists, A through J points about the action-oriented teacher and the recipient-oriented student. The teacher teaches and the students are taught. The teacher knows, the teacher thinks, talks, disciplines, chooses, acts, chooses, confuses. The teacher is the subject of the learning process, while the pupils are mere objects. He had already said that oppression is necrophilic, and it's a death cult. So therefore, the education system also becomes necrophilic. It serves the interest of oppression. And so the oppressed are already dehumanized and oppressed in the larger society, and now they come to school and they become re-objectified within this particular institutional context. Education, he states, as the exercise of domination stimulates the credulity of students with the ideological intent of indoctrinating them to adapt to the world of oppression. That it's just not possible to use the banking educational method in the pursuit of liberation, for they would only negate that very pursuit. The revolutionary society which practices banking education is either misguided or mistrusting of people. And so remember, he was saying that within the oppressor-oppressed classes, that for the oppressor to really cross the line and help the oppressed has to be based on dialogue, listening, mutuality. And so he's saying here that you cannot have a banking model of education, because even as it transfers into a revolutionary society, say, or a post-colonial society, say, because you're not trusting the people if the education is not coming out from the people, from the oppressed. If you can change the educational system in order to be a liberatory practice, then you must change the relationships within the institution between the teacher and the student. He's saying on page 52, liberating education consists in acts of cognition, not transfers of information. On page 53, he continues, the teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is himself taught in dialogue with the students, who in turn, while being taught, also teach. So it has to be this mutuality then, that they become equals, they become partnerships in this educational endeavor. And he also doesn't use the word he as a teacher. I mean, of course, this is, written and researched in the 1960s, but this book was also heavily criticized for its sexist language, and subsequent editions, tried to comb through that language. Education is not just for the sake of learning, especially some obscure concept that you can put up on a shelf, but it's part of praxis. Like, education has to be part of action, and that action has to be liberatory in nature. It has to be helping the people. It has to be doing something concrete and real to help people's daily life. And so he concludes this chapter by saying, problem-posing education as a humanist and liberating praxis posits as fundamental that the people subjected to domination must fight for their emancipation. Problem-posing education does not and cannot serve the interests of the oppressors. No oppressive order could permit the oppressed to begin to question. Why? While only a revolutionary society can carry out this education in systematic terms, the revolutionary leader need not take full power before they can employ the method. And that he's saying that the revolutionary cannot say, oh, we'll keep the old banking model, in the time being, temporarily, but later will change to a more revolutionary educational praxis, mutuality, equal system. He's saying, no, they must be revolutionary, that is to say, dialogical from the outset. So from the beginning of the revolution and from the beginning of education now into a liberatory process, it must be mutual, it must be dialogical. And so in this chapter 2, then, he's really talking about the educational system, the hierarchical system, and how that must be abolished and transformed into a system of dialogue and mutuality and a process of problem solving where it's going to result in praxis, in real world actions. The first sentence in chapter 3 states, "As we attempt to analyze dialogue as a human phenomenon, we discover something which is the essence of dialogue itself, the word." Freire studied phenomenology, and in particular the psychology of language. And then after his education, he was able to work for the government and for universities and implement some of his literary programs. And so in 1962, he was able to have a pilot program where he taught 300 cane workers how to read and write in 45 days. And it was such a successful program, the government allowed the program to be applied on a more large-scale manner, and 3,000 community groups were established. And so this was in 1962, so 1964 there was the military coup, and then he was imprisoned for 70 days. Went to Chile and worked in the agrarian land movement, worked for the UN agrarian organization, and then published his first book about education for freedom, and then this was a subsequent book to that. So all that just to put this chapter in context of phenomenology, the psychology of language, and this chapter is about the word. So this is part of his academic study and as part of his praxis as well. So this chapter also has a religious feel to it, the word. So he's really going to the essence of language and how silence, like for example on the second page he says, human existence cannot be silent, nor can it be nourished by false words, but only by true words with which men and women transform the world. To exist humanly is to name the world, to change it. The power of language, that your oppression lives in silence, repression. For the people to speak true words and to start to name the world around them is to change it. And he continues, dialogue is the encounter between men mediated by the world in order to name the world. It is in speaking their word that people, by naming the world, transform it. Dialogue imposes itself as the way by which they achieve significance as human being. And we can think, politically, democracy, the free speech. I have my First Amendment free speech tattoo here. So just that is a sacred concept within religions, within governments, within democracy, is the right for people to speak. And that repressive governments, that's the first thing that they go after, is the right to speech. They take the words away, they take the platform away, and they arrest those that speak out against the government. And he continues, the dialogue cannot exist, however, in the absence of a profound love for the world and for people. So before he was talking about dialogue, listening, that it's required to fully listen. And of course, this is implying listening to things that you want to hear versus you don't want to hear, the incredible pain and suffering of the oppressed that they would begin to speak upon. Dialogue further requires an intense faith in humankind, faith in their power to make and remake, to create and recreate, faith in their vocation to be more fully human. And finally, he says, true dialogue cannot exist unless the dialoguers engage in critical thinking, thinking which discerns an indivisible solidarity between the world and the people and admits of no dichotomy between them. So in the middle of this chapter, he's talking about humans compared to animals, and talking about the process of thought, the process of language, how that differentiates humans from animals, and that that resonates with chapter 1 again, just the humanizing process versus the dehumanizing process. And so we see that again as it's related to literacy, into understanding words. And he critiques again the banking model of education, that there's no dialogue there, that it's just a one-way deposit. The student can be silent the entire time and just receive the knowledge that's deposited in them. But he's saying in chapter 3, you know, the power of the word, the psychology of language, language learning, and really understanding what each word means. He says on page 74, an epoch is characterized by a complex of ideas, concepts, hopes, doubts, values, and the challenges in dialectical interaction with their opposites, striving towards plenitude. And so now he wants to really get a foundation in people truly understanding and grasping the language, and then applying it to their concrete realities, their praxis. He's saying that the educational system, in order to be liberatory, must really go to the people and understand their thinking and their thought process, and understand how they grapple with particular concepts and define them, and how they are going to apply them without this hierarchical model making demands of them. And this is part of the consciousness raising and critical thinking aspects, which is the ultimate igniter of then the praxis and the revolution. So ultimately, at the end of chapter 3, he's talking about providing these basic tools and resources to the people, the workers, so that they can use them to create their own educational liberatory system that will then result in the praxis, in the material conditions of their lives changing when they have real-world consequences and transformational powers. So chapter 4 starts with the concept of praxis, and so that's the theme. He calls it the theories of cultural action. So before, chapter 1 talked about the oppressor-oppressed society. Chapter 2 talked about the banking model of education. Chapter 3 talked about words, dialogue, literacy, language. And now chapter 4 brings it all together into action. And he's saying that all of that previous education, the knowledge, the learning, the educational system means nothing unless it results ultimately in praxis. And so this is the final chapter 4, which is the praxis now, the application of the entire liberatory system, the challenge of the dehumanizing system of oppression, the takeover of education not from the banking model, but as a liberation institution. We analyzed words and languages and how language can be can create new critical thinking measures and understandings of society. And now is the time for action. Real change has to come about for all of these building blocks to have been established for the praxis, and for the change that's going to result in the humanizing process of bringing the oppressed into their own freedom. Dialogue with the people is radically necessary to every authentic revolution. This is what makes it a revolution, as distinguished from a military coup. One does not expect dialogue from a coup, only deceit or force. So ultimately it's leading to revolution then. It's leading to this post-colonial society, a new government of the people, a new praxis of education as liberation, and a new material reality that humanizes people and does not continue into their oppression. He says on page 109, I have already affirmed that it would indeed be naive to expect the oppressor elites to carry out a liberating education, that it will just never come from these oppressive systems. It's not possible. Divide and rule. The minority cannot permit itself the luxury of tolerating a unification of the people, which would undoubtedly signify a serious threat to their own hegemony. It is in the interest of the oppressor to weaken the oppressed still further, to isolate them, to create and deepen rifts among them. So as the oppressive class, of course, is made up of a minority, the few, they have to be they have to employ many different kinds of methods to further exacerbate divisions within society, because the numbers game. Of course, the oppressed are so many. How can they not overtake the oppressor? That's because of their dependence on the oppressor and their brainwashed position in serving this necrophilic system. The oppressed have only two possibilities. They must either organize authentically for their own liberation, or they will be manipulated by the elites. So they're either oppressed or they're engaged in a revolutionary process. And that in order to have a revolutionary liberatory process, people will have to come together. They will have to become literate. They will have to use education for their own liberation and apply that educational tool to the new society. He has a subsection called organization, so people will now have to come together. They'll have to create new organizations for themselves, new types of leadership in which they challenge the oppressive structures and create their own structures. But it has to have this balance of freedom within it, or else it will just reproduce another authoritarian system with new players. And so now he's talking about this different strata of revolutionary leaders and how they must remain wedded to the people, and that they cannot separate themselves off as a vanguard elite and educate themselves, but they must remain in education, in step and in allyship with the oppressed classes. And so now, you know, it's the time for revolution. It's the time to put these words and education into praxis, and to make sure that the leadership has remained in step with the people. And so those are the main 4 chapters and 4 themes of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a classic educational liberatory book, and something that's really useful for us as we examine the current educational system, especially considering, you know, the other books I've been reading about student debt and academia as a workplace and so on. So let me know, have you read this book, and what do you think? Is it just pie in the sky, or does it have some relevancy and truth to today's educational institution? So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to your comments.